looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. In today's video, I want to look at something which has courted debate amongst comments on my channel in the past and also debates I have had on other YouTubers' videos about classic cinema characters. I'm referring to villains' backstories, their importance, how they help and hinder the antagonists, and, from a psychological perspective, does the insight into why a villain is acting so viciously make them more or less scary? Now, I'm not talking necessarily about the philosophical conflicts between hero and villain, although that will be a little relevant later on, but instead what made them scary, identifiable, or memorable to the viewer. Another question is, as what we don't know or don't see can scare us or trouble us more, such as the monster in the dark or the off-screen violence which is left to our imagination, then does knowing too much about a character spoil their impact? Now, we're going to look at a fair few characters today, and thus we're going to look at their films in isolation. In other words, when talking about Freddy from A Nightmare on Elm Street, for example, we all know his history from sequels, novelizations, and interviews with creators and actors, but we will be ignoring everything learned from part 2 onwards and focusing purely on the first film, as that was the movie which caught lightning in a bottle, and a retrospective lens of 7 movies, a TV show, books, and a remake would be irrelevant and impossible in 1984 when the character first burst onto our screens. Anyway, let's crack on. As human beings, we all search for rationalisation, reason and understanding. It's why the fascination with true crime, i.e. Netflix docuseries and endless books about serial killers, draws such a large interest. In psychological analysis and one-to-one work with subjects, in terms of differing approaches to working with individuals, we have behavioural therapy, where the postulation is that committing a crime is a learned response to situations. Then we have cognitive therapy, where one would explore how individuals solve problems through moral development, information processing, and a response to stimuli forged via experience. In terms of personality and attitude being the pattern of characteristics across the entire matrix of the persona, social interactions, attachments, object relations, biological deficits, and past trauma all go into making the motives for why someone either commits despicable acts or has zero regard and understanding for social norms. In the words of personality disorder expert Theodore Millen, personality is a comprehensive and integrative system perspective. This means that personality is a conception of characteristic patterns of behavioural and interpersonal action, affective experience and expression, and also ideations. Where there are deficits and habits that are resistant to extinction, serious anomalies when meeting developmental milestones, or even severe trauma, the personality changes maladaptively and we get personality disorders. Or, if there are biological problems, severe mental illness can also affect one's interactions with the world. Basically, and at the end of the day, when we learn of a horrific act via the news or we see a documentary about it, we try to piece together an understanding of what made the person do it, what makes them tick, and just how do you get from A to B in terms of murder, mass killing, or fraudulent deviancy. We all search for understanding, motive, rationalisation, and insight all the time. It's how we improve and learn from mistakes, help people, and create more positive outcomes. So let's bring all this back to movie villains and ask the question, does understanding a character make them more scary or more complex? Or does having more information take something away? Let's start with one of the greatest slasher villains of all time from one of the best horror films of all time, Michael Myers from Halloween. At the start of the film, a young girl is stabbed to death in her bedroom post-hanky panky, following a long tracking POV of the killer. We learn at the end of this scene that the killer is a small and very young boy, and the entire scene ends with 2 adults, presumably Michael's parents, facing the shock and worry of seeing him out in the street with a bloodied knife and vacant expression. We don't discover much more information throughout the rest of the film, but what we do learn comes from Dr. Loomis, who has worked with Michael and seen the true evil within. It turns out that Michael Myers has been mute ever since killing Judith Myers, the girl he stabs at the beginning of the film, and has spent the rest of his days staring at a wall, but not at the wall, through the wall, and seemingly into space. No one could reach him, there was nothing behind those eyes, and Dr. Loomis is terrified of him to the point where he wanted to keep him locked up forever. We know nothing else about Michael apart from Loomis's frenetic ramblings about how Myers is the personification of darkness and is just pure evil. There is no abuse mentioned, there is no mental illness discussed, it's just evil and pure evil, and our assessment of Michael is harnessed purely through Loomis's snippets of information about how he has deep black eyes and couldn't be reached. There is no diagnosis, no discussion about how he killed other patients, just one doctor's obsession over his patient. It's through this lack of information but fixated certitude that the pace and momentum builds as, of course Michael is going to kill, and of course it's going to be our cast of totally disposable teens, but ignoring all the unnecessary and frankly rubbish sequels, is Michael Myers more terrifying because there is no rhyme or reason to why he is like this? Or does this lack of backstory make him less impactful? Let's take in contrast Rob Zombie's 2007 remake, where we see a backstory to Michael, set him amidst trailer trash people who are all horrible to him, and, after even showing him making masks in hospital, he is triggered by the staff's repellent behaviour. Now, I'm no fan of Zombie's 2007 remake, but I understand many people are. The issue here is that the pure evil force of nature now has a whole backstory with motivations, and the economic class setting has changed. In Carpenter's Halloween, Michael comes from a wealthy middle-class family and there is no hint of abuse, bullying or anything else. We just start with a kid killing his sister and we get nothing else. In Zombie's version, the family are in poverty and it's no wonder Michael has turned out the way he is with all the truly unpleasant people who dominate his life. Even his escape, which in the 1978 version is shown with zero information to how all the patients got out that night, is triggered by two disgusting redneck people sexually assaulting a woman in front of Michael, and everything in the 2007 remake appeared to need a reason, and this reason was painted with broad strokes to why someone would become a cold-blooded serial killer. In the 1978 version, Michael's escape, fixation with the girls he was going to kill, rearranging of Judith's tombstone, and even his occultic aversion to pain and serious injury was painted via him being a force of nature and just pure evil. And it's this relentless fixation on returning to Haddonfield that keeps him killing. However, if at the midway point of the 1978 version, Dr. Loomis had stated, "Oh yes, Michael's father molested him for years," or his sister locked him in the closet whenever his parents went out and would have sex with her boyfriend in front of him. And would knowing this have made his acts less senseless, more understandable, or would it have made them more scary? Moving on to Freddy Krueger, we find out in the 1984 version that he was a child murderer who the parents of Elm Street killed after the police cocked up his arrest by burning him alive in his boiler room. So, we have a motive now. The killer has returned from beyond the grave to keep killing, but does the fact that he was a killer before he died add anything to his already terrifying visage? Or is Freddy's ability to get you when you are at your most vulnerable, when you're asleep, and then manipulate your dreams so you will never escape him until he kills you, is that the only terrifying prospect that we need? The fact that Freddy was a child murderer already paints everything we need in a single sentence, as child killers / molesters are considered the most base and worst people in society, and Freddy's predilection for power, control, and sexual gratification is already a dot to dot we can make in our heads from the very words child killer. We don't need much more than that, as that alone conjures up unpleasant images, the suggestion of paedophilia, and the killer's unpleasant sexual arousal, and, most of all, the horror of young children being killed activates the empathic parts of our brain and fires our mirror neurons, where we feel the horror via imagining how it could feel if something so awful happened to us or someone we loved. Now, Freddy is already aesthetically disgusting. His burnt skin, drunken gait, and frequent self-mutilation, always done with a giggle, paints his terror for us, and we don't need much more than child killer before he died to activate a cognitive chain that tells us all we need to know, and then shut off the further information parts of our rationalization, as child killer activates our disgust and dismay like a biological trigger. For the Dark Knight's Joker, he has a nebulous backstory where he details varying scenarios of how he got his facial scars, be it a drunken father or mutilating himself in front of his wife, and the less we know makes him more scary, as this adds to the congruence of his unpredictability. For the Joker, his antisocial personality anarchistic outlook and chaotic cruelty is congruent with his ever-shifting origin story, which comes from Alan Moore's comic book The Killing Joke, where the Joker states, "If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice," and this adds depth to his character because the whole point of the Joker is not understanding him. Batman was made by Bruce Wayne's parents' death, and he seeks justice, order, and redemption. The Joker is his polar opposite, the yin to his yang, and seeks chaos and anarchy. So, if we have too much information about the clown prince of crime, it gives reason to his insanity, and, for better impact as the Joker is made up of anomalies, the only congruence he should have is incongruence itself. The Joker is a little different to many comic book villains as they tend to have a very detailed backstory. The reasons for this are usually to do with their conflict with the hero, how their past has set them off on a doomed arc, and also to highlight the nobility of the hero, as most comic book heroes go through ordeals only to come out stronger and more decent. In the Avengers Infinity War, Thanos wants to collect the Infinity Stones so he can snap his fingers and wipe out half of all living things. The reason for this is that on his home planet, a once thriving society was reduced to chaos and extinction by greed and not respecting the natural resources and order of life. Mirroring our own existential worries about global warming, resource guarding, pollution, greed, and overpopulation, Thanos has a very clear method to his madness, and we need this to complete his character, make sense of his mission, and add the conflict. Thanos has travelled the universe, wiping out half of populations on various planets by a fair and random system, and his reasoning for this bloodshed is that he is helping people. A cold-blooded killer of millions, yet respectful and, in his own words, merciful to the future of the universe, you can think Thanos is right, wrong, stupid, or genius, but his backstory makes cognitive sense through the cognitive chain of event, behaviour, and outcome, and this enriches his on-screen presence. If we were to give the Michael Myers approach to Thanos, a mad tyrant just killing people for no other reason than he is evil, then the Avengers would still assemble, we would still cheer Iron Man at the end, and there would still be a 2-hour movie of fights and explosions, but the villain would have no depth, no moral conflict, and would just be a "I want to rule the universe" shallow concept which offers nothing. Times have changed, and audiences are both more savvy and require more respect. Also, the deeper the character, the more memorable they are, and, as we have witnessed a world changed by politics, 9/11, wars, climate change, 24-hour news, real-life tragedies played out by mobile phone footage, natural disasters, and so many more things, the simple interpretation of right and wrong, necessary and unnecessary, are different in all of us. However, Halloween isn't a blockbuster Marvel movie. It's a slasher horror film, so its remit is always going to be different, and it's an unfair comparison. But, as Michael Myers is just the embodiment of evil, does evil need a backstory? If I was to ask you now, define evil, we would get hundreds of different interpretations. Halloween wants its villain to be a force of nature, a human anomaly, and someone beyond redemption and comprehension, and its way of conveying that is to remove the reason, rationalisation, and understanding completely. Star Wars introduced us to Darth Vader, and he was the Imperial Overlord of the galaxy. His motivations were subjugating the galaxy, and, although we learn about the Emperor, Luke being his son, and then get a 3-film prequel in the late 90s and early 2000s, Star Wars worked as it painted Vader as the terrifying villain who was leading the Empire, and the Empire's quest was to rule the universe totalitarian style. A story of good and evil, the first Star Wars film shows a despotic regime, and we don't need much more to make Darth one of the best villains of all time. His breathing, black mask, penchant for force-choking people, and proudness to commit mass genocide by blowing up a planet with his Death Star was enough. We understand Nazism. We understand Vader has an occultic ability unlike the other generals on the Death Star, and the fact that Vader has a Death Star, fleet of massive ships, and an army of stormtroopers at his mercy paints him as a dictator at the height of his powers rather than a villain on a journey. The Empire is the real villain of Star Wars, and Vader the terrifying honcho who leads it. We don't meet the Emperor until Empire Strikes Back, and he's only mentioned very briefly in A New Hope. So, although Ben tells us that Luke's father was killed by his former apprentice Darth Vader, and thus we make a personal connection and general localised conflict amidst a story about a space army conquering the galaxy, Obi-Wan paints Vader in a very simple sentence. He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil. Whatever Darth was, he is no more. I'm going to finish with Hannibal Lecter and look at Silence of the Lambs. Now, I know Manhunter, the adaptation of the book Red Dragon, came out first in the 1980s, but as Silence was presented almost as its own film, and many people who watched it wouldn't have read the book or even seen Manhunter, it stands as a seminal piece of cinema with a screen-defining villain. Well, technically there are two villains in Silence of the Lambs, the first being Hannibal Lecter, and the second being the woman-skinning Jamie Gumb. For Lecter, we meet him as a fully fledged serial killer and all his blanks are filled in by Crawford or Dr. Chilton. We know he's a cannibal, we know he bit the face of a nurse leaning over him and ate her tongue, and, when trying to intimidate Clarice later, we know that he ate the liver of a census who tried to test him. Lecter is a masterclass of not blinking, incongruent and cold body posture, and a snarling venom which is contained in a perspex cage, as bars would mean he'll be able to reach through and bite someone. Lecter doesn't go over his past and, despite getting Clarice to talk intimately about her own ordeals, he remains stoic in keeping his own history to himself and thus letting the audience fill in the blanks. Lecter is scary because of the lengths needed to keep him in that cell, and by this I mean all the security and the severity of the guidelines Clarice has to keep to, the aggrandising by Dr. Chilton, and also the FBI warnings to Clarice about how you don't want him in your head. Here, the powerful use of limited but graphic information offers so much more, starting from the reaction of everyone else between the moment Clarice is told she's going to see Lecter and then, upon meeting him, seeing his unorthodox cell and calm demeanour amidst the other insane inmates. His eventual escape is even more horrifying because of the words, stories, and even the need to muzzle him like an animal whilst he is transported to his new and less secure prison. Lecter's backstory is disjointed, keeps only the nastiest parts, and doesn't mention anything else as a method to build the fear. For the woman skinner Jamie Gumb, also known as Buffalo Bill, he is less eloquent, more confused in his identity, and, in terms of his history, we only get 2 bits of concise but vague information which are both saddening and chilling at the same time. Lecter states that Buffalo Bill wasn't born a killer, but became one through years of systematic child abuse, so this time we have a motive for his homicidal behaviour. And later in the film, when his prisoner threatens to harm his dog if he doesn't let her go, he screams quite chillingly, "You don't know what pain is," when she threatens to physically hurt his beloved pet. Silence of the Lambs doesn't dwell on Buffalo Bill's years of systematic child abuse. That's kept to a single sentence, and our imaginations are asked to amalgamate with Buffalo Bill's on-screen portrayal to join up the dots. Basically, less is used as more. Also, when he makes the blood-curdling proclamation, "You don't know what pain is," we see a rare glimpse of the control and power that serial killers love now diffusing into the rage which drives them and the untreated trauma which has warped Buffalo Bill's personality. Both Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill have nebulous backgrounds because our imagination is asked to create a personal story, because what scares me wouldn't necessarily scare you, and some people's experiences and perceptions of abuse and trauma are worse than other people's. However, dwelling too much on the motives of Buffalo Bill's abuse would join too many dots, and thus the imaginations will be overruled. So, it's a fine balancing act of releasing necessary but limited information while showing that, whilst one killer is incarcerated and the other one is free, these people walk among us and we would never even know they are there until it was too late. We never know why Michael Myers killed Judith Myers and then waited 15 years in prison before escaping, and we don't need to. Being mute and seemingly impervious to pain and injuries which would severely impair other people, or at the very least cause them to scream in agony, is enough. Now, Halloween could have hinted at Michael's past and talked about abuse or odd behaviour, but for Myers, less is definitely more when it comes to the faceless and silent force of nature. However, for other villains, the Myers approach just wouldn't cut it, and we need some elucidation. And this is not only what makes them more terrifying, as you have much more chance of reasoning with Thanos and Buffalo Bill as you do with Michael Myers, in terms of stopping them from killing, but we can also engage with their motives on a level of understanding. For example, abuse can be cyclic. In other words, abuse can cause psychological damage and then, and I stress not in all cases, the abuse can lead a victim into becoming an abuser. So what's scarier? Backstory or no backstory? How much is too much, and what and when isn't enough? And does the Michael Myers lack of information make him more scary or just stupid in terms of the viewer's enjoyment of the film and the memories they take home at night when they go to sleep? It's important to remember that uncertainty brings discomfort, and this increases when there are situations of threat and menace. For our own brains, when watching films, we are trying to predict what happens next, guess what's coming, and also, because it's a detached art form and not real, place ourselves in the shoes of both protagonist and antagonist. For Michael Myers, much like those strangers in that film, The Strangers, and also Jason Voorhees, the mask hides their faces, and so 70% of the non-verbal communication we need when interacting with people is obscured. It's why masks upset us. They hide emotion, present an incongruity, and obfuscate our mirror into the face as, looking at someone's face, we can see someone's arousal, anger, calmness, and so forth, all within the 0.7 seconds our brains need to identify the emotions and intents. It works similar for reasoning. We all reason everything and, taking Thanos for example, we have depth to someone trying to slaughter half of all life because we are given a glimpse of his frame of reference as we know he came from a world which was dying. Yes, he is narcissistic and extreme, but seeing him at the end of his journey after losing his homeworld, we can see the motive even if it's based on insanity and greed. Many have asked why Thanos couldn't have snapped more resources into existence, but this misses the point. He knows that if he did this, then it's only a matter of time before greed takes these two, and the world needs a balance of not having too much and learning to share what they have. Or maybe this is myopic on Thanos' part, and, by knowing more about him, we can see how logical and more merciful thinking is lost to his warped vision. For Michael Myers, we don't really want to be in that frame of reference because it's one of severe mental illness. Halloween isn't a comic book or philosophical discussion. It's about a severely disturbed individual escaping and killing people. Loomis refers to Michael as something inhuman, and his lack of sexual preference, desire for anything, his anhedonia and bizarre, inexpressive rage is meant to just make you uncomfortable because the second we explain Michael, he becomes more human, so his lack of motive and reasoning fits with Loomis's assessment. And in terms of Lecter, did the movie Hannibal and the prequel Hannibal Rising make him more or less scary? Yes, I know the impact had worn off by then, but as author Thomas Harris focused more on Lecter as the books continued and the movies made more money, they even increased Hannibal's screen time in the Red Dragon remake, this focus made him more pop culture icon, but did seeing his youth and experiences add anything more frightening to that creature who was kept in a plastic cage all those years ago? The book, Making Sense of Violence, cites that violence can be seen as a cultural act which stems from society at its precise time of its shared norms and values. With the current explosion of comic book movies, Netflix crime documentaries, and swirls of independent media, disinformation, and climate change, the reflections of many villains will change and be portrayed in response to this artistic portrayal of current concerns. In the 1970s, there was a big shift in treatment of mental health and recognition of mental health disorders. And Halloween's Michael Myers was created following John Carpenter's visit to a mental institution and meeting someone who stared at him with soulless black eyes. Opinions were changing in the late 70s, but so was the worry and stigmas of what mental health represented. Thanos, on the other hand, who was of course created by Marvel many years ago, seems more apt now as we are barraged with resource concerns and climate change, and thus a moral debate on how we manage the sheer volume of people on our planet makes his story more poignant. The point is, we all live in this world and we all see it through a frame of reference with varying levels of prejudice, fear, acceptance, and we all try and make sense of what we interpret. Therefore, when presented with someone doing awful things, they can be made to be more repellent or sympathetic by the viewer via a backstory, motivation, or lack of in order to trigger either fear or complex interest in their philosophy. Anyway, that's it for now. So, in the meantime, please like, share, subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment as they always generate good debate. And until next time, I'll catch you later.
Like most artists, I'm a product of my influences. I love Lucy, Dick Van Dyke, my mom who would wash my penis with scalding hot water.